the early 19th century, the Mississippi River gave rise to a series of new settlements, which would eventually evolve into the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. The longtime home of Dakota and Ojibwe people is today home to more than 3 million residents, and the site of the most valuable single piece of land between Chicago and San Francisco. However, the question remains, why are these cities located here? What unique geographic features made each place advantageous? Why two competing urban centers 12 miles apart instead of just one? And how have the Twin Cities evolved since their original settlement? The first European settlement was located at Fort Snelling in 1819. Its location upon the commanding bluff above the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers became an important point of defense in the upper north central region. Across the river from Fort Snelling, a trading post and the village of Mendota was located with high hopes of becoming the future seat of regional settlement. However, with the advent of the railroad and the development of new urban centers to the east and west, Mendota's early popularity dwindled. After a group of squatters were expelled from Fort Snelling in 1838, they established another settlement, located further downstream along the northern banks of the Mississippi River, at the location of Fountain Cave. The settlement was first named Pig's Eye after its first European inhabitant, a trapper and moonshiner named Pierre Pig's Eye Parent, so called because he was blind in one eye. He established a tavern and the first settlement just south of the future location of St. Paul. Just north, Lambert's Landing, the easiest point of access from the north, was renamed St. Paul in accordance with the wishes of Father Lucien Gaultier. The earliest traceable native title was Imin-i-Ja-Ska, meaning White Rock, in honor of the city's prominent limestone bluffs. St. Paul was a logical place for a settlement. It was located near the confluence of two great rivers and at the easiest point of access from the north. The location of bluffs just to the west of the access point allowed for permanent settlement above the floodplain, and the city quickly grew to become the region's largest. It was an obvious choice to become territorial capital in 1849 and later became the state capital by defeating another river town, St. Peter, in 1858. By 1862, St. Paul was home to more than 10,000 people, nearly twice as many inhabitants as the next largest city, and squarely located as the headwaters of navigation for the entire Mississippi River. Settlement also took place north of Fort Snelling, first at St. Anthony on the east bank of the Mississippi in 1848, and then later across the river on the west bank at Minneapolis in 1853. St. Anthony, the older and easternmost city, enjoyed a brief period of dominance over Minneapolis, but eventually joined under the name of the latter in 1872. The name, like the city, come from a combination of names, Minne being the Dakota word for water, and Polis being the Greek word for city. The unique advantages of this particular stretch of river are twofold. One obvious advantage is that of Nicollet Island, the easiest place to cross the mighty Mississippi. And in 1855, it became the site of the first bridge of any kind to do so. Further ensuring that this would be the primary crossing point is the fact that a half-mile downstream from Nicollet Island are the Falls of St. Anthony. The stories of the falls first reached Europe in 1680, following reports from Father Louis Hennepin, and the opportunity to harness water power made this stretch of land desirable. The first settler to attempt such an endeavor was Franklin Steele, who started the first sawmill at St. Anthony. Later, the Falls region would evolve into a source of textiles and then gain its eventual identity as a center of flour milling. Cadwallader Washburn built the first mill in 1874, which exploded in what became known as the Great Mill Disaster. When it was rebuilt in 1880, it was the largest mill in the world, eventually evolving into General Mills. However, Washburn's A mill remained the world's largest for only 1 year, when Charles Pillsbury built a bigger mill across the river in St. Anthony. It would remain the world's largest for 40 years and help earn Minneapolis its self-proclaimed title of the flour milling capital of the world. With the meaning of both east-west access at Nicollet Island and power courtesy of St. Anthony Falls, Minneapolis would eventually supplant St. Paul as the region's largest city. The relative advantage of each was summed up succinctly by Richard Hartshorne in 1932. St. Paul is situated at the head of main river navigation, at a 10-mile separation of minor navigable branches, on the outside of a great river bend, and at a site most convenient for gaining access to the river. Minneapolis-St. Anthony was situated at the most convenient river crossing and at the source of water power from the falls. The importance of railroad transport during this era further cemented the need for both of these two centers. With the Minnesota River to the south, the most logical place to cross the river only once was located at Minneapolis-St. Anthony. The proximity to this bustling milling district also made a rail yard in Minneapolis advantageous. However, with St. Paul still representing an essential point of entry for the Mississippi River and the provincial political center, its connections were also of paramount importance. The lack of access or integration has also marked the definition of these two cities. The term Twin Cities was first introduced in 1872, when it was suggested that Minneapolis absorbed St. Paul. But of course, this idea was quickly rejected. In addition to cultural differences and desires for uniqueness, the 12-mile distance has successfully prevented formal integration and created a relationship perhaps best described as being one of interdependence. The evolution of this region is clearly linked with changes in transportation. The Twin Cities came of age largely during an era dominated by steamships and railroads, and each played a crucial role in defining the cities. The location of both Minneapolis and St. Paul along rivers highlight the importance of travel along the Mississippi. And the development of a railroad infrastructure to complement this pattern also helped cement these two unique locations. Along with the increased dominance of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the development of both Fort Snelling and Mendota slowed dramatically. Mendota has since become a historic district, home to the region's first church and a former trade hub for the American Fur Company. Fort Snelling still remains a historic landmark and is located adjacent to the current Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport, which also takes advantage of the bluff location and wide river boulevard. Although Minneapolis came to eclipse the population of St. Paul in the 19th century, St. Paul had already become a mature urban center and the clear head of politics for the state. Owing to its early days, the St. Paul Central Business District, or CBD, extends north from the river along a narrow band between Minnesota and Wabasha Street. The rest of the city evolved during an era dominated by streetcar and, eventually, automobile traffic. And today's city still reflects some of these early patterns of settlement. Essentially a city of hills, wealthy residents, like James J. Hill, whose home is still located on Summit Avenue, chose to place their homes up on the bluffs overlooking the city. Conversely, new immigrants typically located themselves in places of the city with lower elevation. With the popularization of the automobile, increased suburbanization also took place outside of St. Paul. First-tier suburbs like Roseville, Maplewood, West and South St. Paul, Lilydale, Mendota, and Mendota Heights located themselves just outside the borders of the city. Eventually, second-tier suburbs like Woodbury, Apple Valley, Rosemount have also developed around St. Paul. Although this suburbanization changed the composition of St. Paul significantly, its population has continued to grow slightly, from 271,000 in 1930 to 287,000 in 2000. This is probably in large part due to the value of historically significant, commonly Victorian housing and gentrification, coupled with an influx of new immigrants. Minneapolis, however, has seen an opposite trend. More impacted by suburbanization, with more room to expand west, Minneapolis' population declined from 464,000 in 1930 to 382,000 in 2000. Minneapolis, the city of lakes, was also largely shaped by its transportation past. With its prominent depot and river A mill adorning the landscape, the Minneapolis CBD also stretches away from the river in a narrow band centered around Marquette Avenue and the Nicollet Mall. The city evolved during an era dominated by the streetcar, and the lakes area located southwest of Minneapolis quickly grew in popularity for commuters. With its industrial core and warehousing districts located north of the city, the near north and northeast areas served as a logical location for working men's homes. Minneapolis's most wealthy residents primarily located themselves along a geographic feature known as the Devil's Backbone. This area, home to Kenwood, and eventually the site of the man-made Lake of the Isles, attracted residents as did locations along Lakes Calhoun, Harriet, and Nokomis, and along the Mississippi River bluffs. With increased access and more commuters, additional suburbs were developed, the first tier of which included St. Louis Park, Golden Valley, Robbinsdale, Brooklyn Center, Fridley, Richfield, and Edina. Later, with the Highway Act of 1960, second and third tier suburbs were developed, such as Brooklyn Park, Crystal, Coon Rapids, Minnetonka, Plymouth, Eden Prairie, and Bloomington. Today, the population continues to expand further out from the internal core, and the city of Minneapolis is still home to far fewer residents than it was 100 years ago. Recent changes, such as the development of a light rail network, continue to define the patterns of urban settlement that link people together within the Twin Cities. As for the future, that's anybody's guess.